Top 10 creepiest ghost towns in the Outback. Locals warn you not to visit. They found her car parked outside the old pub in Silverton. Engine off. Keys still in the ignition. Her phone sitting on the passenger seat with 17 missed calls. She was a travel blogger, 29 years old, who had driven out there alone one Tuesday morning to take photos of the abandoned buildings. By Wednesday night, her family had reported her missing. The search party found her 3 kilometers into the desert, sitting against a dead mulga tree, with her knees pulled to her chest. She wasn't injured. She wasn't dehydrated. When they asked what happened, she said she heard someone call her name from inside one of the empty buildings. So she went in, and then she just kept walking. Nobody explains what that means. Here in Australia, we have a habit of building things in places we probably shouldn't. Towns carved out of red dirt and shimmering heat, raised up by gold rushes and copper booms, and dreams that almost always ended the same way. The people left. The buildings stayed. And something else stayed with them. The Outback covers roughly 3.5 million square kilometers. Inside all of that silence, there are more than 400 abandoned settlements. Some are on no official map. What they all share is that the locals, the people who actually know these places, consistently say the same thing. Don't go there. Especially not alone. And definitely not at night. Today we're going inside 10 of them. From the blood-soaked ruins of colonial-era massacres to the radiation-dusted streets of atomic test sites, from sealed mine shafts where men disappeared and were never recovered to towns that were literally buried by the government and pretended never to exist. This is the story of Australia's most haunted, most forsaken, and most deeply unsettling abandoned places. Stay with us. This one goes deep. If this is the kind of content you're into, hit subscribe and turn on the bell. We cover Australian history and geography every week, and we go to the places the tourism boards prefer you didn't know about. Now, let's get into it. When most people think of Australian ghost towns, they picture peeling paint and rusty windmills. What they don't picture is arriving at a place and immediately wanting to leave. Altunga, in the Northern Territory, about 110 kilometres east of Alice Springs, is that kind of place. It was Australia's first gold rush town in the Red Centre, established in the 1880s, and at its peak, miners scraped out a desperate existence in what they described in letters home as a cursed location. Water was scarce, the heat was catastrophic. Men died of disease, dehydration, and violence at rates the colonial newspapers chose not to print in full. The township still stands, maintained as a heritage site by Parks Australia. But rangers who work there rotate out faster than almost any other posting in the country. Former staff describe a persistent feeling of being watched from empty stone buildings, and others report hearing voices at dusk, a low murmur like an argument just out of earshot. One ranger, who worked Altunga for 6 months in 2019, wrote on an Australian travel forum that he found fresh footprints in the red dirt near the old jail on 3 separate occasions. The footprints led toward the ruins and simply stopped. No return tracks. No explanation. The broader landscape carries what the Eastern Arrernte people describe as very deep significance. Community elders have stated that the area where the colonial settlement sits was already considered a place of caution long before any European arrived. That collision of grief, the dispossession of a people, and the deaths of those who displaced them has left something in the soil that visitors consistently describe and consistently struggle to articulate. You can visit Altunga during daylight hours, but the access road is unsealed. The nearest help is 2 hours away, and the site has a habit of making people feel like they should have stayed home. There is a town in South Australia that the Australian government spent decades pretending didn't exist in the way it actually did. Maralinga is the most radioactive ghost town on Earth. In the 1950s and 1960s, the British government, with Australian cooperation, conducted nuclear weapons tests across a stretch of South Australian desert covering more than 3,000 square kilometres. The local Maralinga Tjarutja people were removed from their ancestral country with minimal notice. Some didn't leave in time. The promised cleanup was conducted so poorly that independent assessments decades later found plutonium-contaminated soil scattered across an area the size of Greater Sydney. The abandoned test village still stands in the desert. Built to resemble a typical Australian country town, it contained houses, cars, and mannequins positioned at windows and in backyards to measure blast effects. After the tests, everything was left behind. The melted cars still sit in the red dirt. The scorched houses still contain the frames of furniture. There is something about the way the structures are positioned, turned slightly inward toward where the blast came from, that makes the whole settlement feel frozen mid-flinch. Access to Maralinga requires permission from the Maralinga Tijarucha community and a South Australian government permit. There are still areas marked off due to ongoing radiation risk. The Charucha people describe the land as deeply wounded, a place that needs to heal without visitors walking through it. The few journalists granted access describe a quality of wrongness that goes beyond the visible evidence. One photojournalist, who spent 2 days documenting the site in 2021, said she found it nearly impossible to sleep. Not because of noise, the place is utterly silent, but because of a persistent certainty that something was standing just outside her tent. If you drive north from Port Augusta and keep going past Quorn, past Hawker, past Blinman, you eventually hit a stretch of road where the bitumen gives out and the GPS becomes uncertain. The landscape starts doing something to your sense of direction that you can't account for. Keep going and you find Farina. Farina was supposed to be a wheat farming town. Established in 1878 and named after the Latin word for flour, it briefly functioned as a genuine settlement with a hotel, a bakery, a butcher, and a railway. Then the rain stopped, not just for a season. The region entered a prolonged drought cycle. The farmers had no framework for understanding. The crops failed. The families left. By the 1920s, Farina was empty. What makes Farina unusual is the quality of the ruins. The stone buildings have survived remarkably intact, which means when you walk through Farina, you are not seeing collapsed rubble. You are seeing empty rooms, complete rooms, with doorways you walk through and windows you look out of, attached to nothing. The roofs are gone, so sky presses into every interior space, but the walls are chest high and solid. It feels less like ruins and more like a stage set the actors abandoned mid-scene. People do visit, and volunteers have been partially restoring sections of the town, but the volunteers themselves speak of an emotional weight that settles onto you somewhere around the second day, not dread, something closer to grief, though you can't identify what you're mourning. Local Adnyamathanha community members have noted that the land in this region does not forget easily. They describe Farina as a place that absorbed a particular kind of human desperation and still holds it. Here is something that doesn't get discussed enough when people talk about Australia's ghost towns. Many of the people who died in these places didn't die peacefully. Cossack, in Western Australia, roughly 150 kilometres north of Karratha, was the first coastal settlement in the Pilbara and an early pearling hub. At its peak in the late 1800s, it was considered one of the most significant ports in the northwest of the continent. It was also the site of sustained, documented violence against Aboriginal people. The pearling industry was built substantially on the forced labour of First Nations people, a practice that continued for decades with the tacit approval of colonial authorities. The workers who died, and many died from exhaustion, drowning, and violence, were not given recorded burials. The town's official histories mention the pearling industry's success without dwelling on how that success was extracted. Among the Ngaluma and Yinjibandi people, whose ancestors are part of the ground underneath those photogenic ruins, Cossack is not a quaint heritage site. It is a place of documented suffering. Multiple travel accounts, particularly from people who camped overnight in the area, describe a quality of unease they attribute to the place itself, rather than to any external factor. One overlander, who camped near the old port in 2022, wrote that he spent most of the night sitting upright in his tent, listening to movement around the empty buildings. He walked the whole site with his torch. Empty. He packed up and drove before sunrise. Kenona sits about 18 kilometres east of Kalgoorlie and was once a town of 12,000 people. 12,000. At the peak of the Western Australian gold rush, Kenona had its own electric tram system, 23 hotels, 3 breweries, and a population density comparable to a modern suburb. Today there is nothing left except a cairn, a historical marker, and a patch of disturbed earth that reveals itself only on close examination to have once been streets. The town was not destroyed. It was not flooded or burned or bombed. It simply left. Between 1905 and 1910, as the gold ran out, the residents dismantled their own town and carried it away. They loaded houses onto horse-drawn drays and drove them to Kalgoorlie. They pulled up the railway tracks and sold them for scrap. They took the tram lines, the telegraph poles, the hotel signs. They erased themselves so completely that standing in Kenona today, knowing that 12,000 people once occupied this exact ground, creates a cognitive dissonance that visitors describe as genuinely destabilizing. It is not haunted in the conventional sense. There are no buildings for ghosts to stand in, but the scale of the absence is its own kind of horror. The Goldfields historian John Boyle has written that Kenona represents a uniquely Australian form of erasure, a town that committed a kind of collective self-destruction rather than allowing itself to slowly decay. Local Wangkatha and Wangi custodians note that this part of the Goldfields landscape carries very old stories about the impermanence of human attachment to country. The gold rush towns, they have observed, came and went like weather. The land noticed. The land always notices. Silverton, 14 kilometres northwest of Broken Hill, is perhaps Australia's most famous ghost town. It has been used as a film location for Mad Max 2, Priscilla Queen of the Desert, and A Town Like Alice. It has a functioning pub. It attracts tourists. It is not, by any meaningful definition, truly abandoned. And yet, the handful of permanent residents who have planted themselves in Silverton deliberately, the artists and eccentrics who chose this place specifically, consistently describe being in Silverton at night as qualitatively different from anything else they've encountered. The town sits in a natural bowl in the landscape, and on still nights the silence is described as pressurized, as though the air itself is being held back by something just outside the visible range. The old Silverton Gaol, built in 1889 and decommissioned after only a few years due to population decline, is the focal point of most of the town's stranger stories. The jail processed a significant number of prisoners awaiting trial for serious crimes in the colonial period. Several died in custody. The conditions were consistent with the standards of the era, which is to say, they were appalling. The jail has been cleaned up and is now open for visitors. Multiple tourist groups have reported hearing a dragging sound inside it during daytime visits, like something heavy being moved across stone that has no identified source. The caretaker who has maintained the site for the past decade has a policy of locking the jail an hour before sunset and not returning until morning. He will tell you why if you ask, but he prefers not to be quoted. Number 4 on this list is not well known outside of Queensland, and there are people in Queensland who would prefer to keep it that way. Cumberland, in the Etheridge Goldfield region of North Queensland, was a significant mining settlement in the 1880s and 1890s. It is also one of the documented sites of severe violence against Chinese miners during the Australian gold rushes, a period that historians have described as involving mob massacres on multiple occasions. Chinese miners in Queensland faced systematic, often officially sanctioned persecution throughout the late colonial period. At Cumberland specifically, documented incidents include the destruction of Chinese camps, the murder of at least several Chinese workers by mobs, and the subsequent failure of authorities to prosecute anyone. The Chinese workers who died at Cumberland were largely buried without official record, their names not included in any colonial registry. The ruins of Cumberland today sit in remote North Queensland, accessible only via an unsealed track that becomes impassable after rain. The few people who have visited in recent decades describe the experience consistently. You feel the history there before you read any of the historical markers. You feel it in your stomach. One academic historian who visited Cumberland as part of a research project on Goldfields' racial violence wrote in her field notes that she found it impossible to maintain professional detachment at the site. Near what would have been the Chinese camp, she felt, with sudden certainty, that the air around her was occupied. She does not use the word haunted in her published academic work, but she uses it in her personal accounts of that day. South Australia has more ghost towns per capita than any other Australian state, and one of the strangest is strange for reasons that have nothing to do with mines. Kooringa, near Burra, surrounds the site of the Burra copper mine, which opened in 1845 and was for a time the largest copper mine in the British Empire. The settlement housed workers and their families in a town that was genuinely prosperous at its peak. One of the more unusual features was that a significant portion of the workforce lived underground. Not as a figure of speech. Literally underground. The miners and their families, predominantly Cornish immigrants, excavated the banks of the Burra Creek and built dugout dwellings in the creek walls, some of them remarkably elaborate, with multiple rooms, chimneys, and furniture. At the peak of this arrangement, approximately 2,000 people were living in creek bank dugouts. Walking along the creek today, you can see the entrances to these underground rooms still embedded in the earth walls, mostly collapsed but identifiable. The effect is of walking past a series of open mouths. The creek runs past them with a sound that multiple visitors have described, consistently and independently, as almost like breathing. Several of the more intact dugout chambers are accessible to visitors. Park rangers note that mobile phone batteries drain unusually quickly inside them, which they attribute to the thick earthen walls. There is no other technical explanation offered for why the chambers consistently feel warmer than the ambient temperature outside, regardless of the season. We are now at the 2 locations on this list that generate the most documented incidents. And by documented, I mean accounts that have been independently corroborated, written down, and in some cases reported to police. Gwalia, in the Western Australian goldfields, about 800 kilometres north-northeast of Perth, was a gold mining town that operated from 1897 to 1963. At its peak, it employed hundreds of workers and was dominated by the Sons of Gwalia gold mine, managed for a period by a young American engineer named Herbert Hoover, who would later become the 31st President of the United States. Hoover's former residence still stands in Gwalia, restored as a museum. But the museum is not what we're here for. The workers' cottages at Gwalia are what we're here for. The residential area has been preserved largely, as it was on the day the mine closed. The furniture is still inside the houses. The curtains are still on the windows. Personal belongings left behind in 1963 remain in the rooms. Kitchen utensils, children's toys, photographs on mantelpieces. These are not ruins. They are rooms that have been frozen mid-occupation for 60 years. Multiple visitors over the years have reported the same specific experiences. The most common is hearing footsteps on the wooden floors of houses they are standing outside of. The second most common is a strong and inexplicable sensation of being unwelcome, a physical feeling rather than a thought, concentrated in the cottages with intact furniture. A photographer who spent a week documenting Gwalia in 2020 described her camera malfunctioning exclusively inside 2 specific cottages and functioning normally everywhere else. She had the camera serviced in Perth upon her return. The technician found nothing wrong with it. Nothing at all. Number 1 on this list is a location that some people in rural Western Australia would prefer was not on a publicly available video. Kew sits in the Murchison region of Western Australia, about 650 kilometres north of Perth. There are roughly 200 permanent residents, a hotel, a caravan park. By any normal definition, Kew is not a ghost town. But Kew sits in a region so densely layered with abandoned settlements that the present-day town feels like a small island in an enormous sea of abandonment. The surrounding Murchison landscape contains the ruins of at least 14 separate settlements within 50 kilometres, including Day Dawn, which was once larger than Kew itself. Day Dawn operated from the 1890s to the 1920s, and at its peak housed around 2,000 people, with its own hospital, newspaper, and school. Today it is a cleared lot, with some stone foundations and a single standing chimney that nobody has managed to pull down. The lot has a particular quality. Multiple people who have stopped there describe it as the most aggressively empty place they have ever stood in. Not empty in the sense of nothing present, empty in the sense that you are intensely aware of what is missing. The scale of what once existed, mapped against the absolute nothing that occupies the space now, creates an almost physical pressure. Several visitors have reported nausea at Day Dawn's centre. 2 separate accounts from unrelated travellers describe the same experience of briefly losing the ability to determine which direction they had come from, while standing in a flat open space with visibility for hundreds of metres in every direction. One of the Wajiri Yamachi people, whose country this has always been, told a regional newspaper that the Murchison is full of places where something was done to the land that the land hasn't finished responding to. She didn't need to explain what responding meant. Locals in Kew will tell you it's fine to drive the surrounding ghost town circuit in daylight. They get quiet when you ask about driving it at night. There is a specific recommendation scattered across four-wheel drive forums and travel blogs, often in different words, but always carrying the same essential message. Do not camp at day dawn. Nobody has ever clearly explained why. The recommendation just exists, repeated by enough people who have been there that it has the quality of a rule rather than a suggestion. And in a place this isolated, where the nearest help is hours away and phone signal is unreliable, that kind of rule tends to get followed. There is a reason locals warn you away from these places. Some of it is practical. The roads are bad, the heat is extreme, the distances are vast, and if your car breaks down between Kew and Meekatharra on a 43-degree January day, the situation turns serious very quickly. But some of it is not practical. Australia's ghost towns are young enough that the people who built them are within living memory, but old enough that the living memory is fraying. The grief inside these places, the dispossession of First Nations people, the deaths of desperate settlers, the violence and failure and erasure, has not had time to become mythology. It sits close to the surface. You can feel it through the soles of your shoes. The Outback does not perform its history for you. It just holds it, all of it, in the silence between the spinifex and the empty windows and the dry creek beds and the satelliteless sky. And when you stand in it long enough, in places where enough happened, the accumulation tends to make itself known. Whether you call that haunting or history or the land's long memory is entirely up to you. What the locals call it, consistently, across every region we visited tonight, is reason enough to turn around. Drive safe, keep your tank full, and maybe next time, pick somewhere with a few more living people in it.